Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez, and we're excited to bring you part one of a two-part series from my interview with the founder and president of Stand to Reason, Greg Koukl. The topic for the interview is how to effectively engage non-believers about Christianity. In part one, Greg lays out some very helpful tactics to help Christians confidently discuss their faith with others. In part two, Greg applies these tactics to some of the most common objections Christians face today. So we hope you enjoy part one of this two-part series with Greg Koukl. I have the incredible honor of speaking with someone who has left a tremendous impact on my faith and as an apologist, and unknowingly has served as a remote mentor of mine from a distance, so to speak. And that is the founder and president of Stand to Reason, Greg Koukl. Greg, thank you so much for jumping on and speaking with me.
Well, it's a treat to talk with you, and I was glad to find out, as we talked before the broadcast, that I and Stand to Reason had such a significant role in your life. So I hope that continues and is helpful to your listeners and whatever your tribe is as well. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm excited to have our listeners get to know more about Stand to Reason. I'm sure most of our listeners are familiar with your work if they're into the apologetic realm.
Mm-hmm.
But for those unfamiliar, would you mind providing an overview of Stand to Reason and what you guys are doing over there?
Sure. Actually, 1 week 1 month from yesterday, from the time we're doing this podcast, will be our 32nd anniversary of Stand to Reason.
Wow.
And I was in my early 40s when I started, and I guess I was 42 years old. And the idea then was there weren't a lot of apologetics things happening, and most of the conversation in the culture about spiritual things, and that includes not just theological elements, but ethical concerns as well, say abortion, and I know this is an area you're well invested in. It was kind of shrill, and it was also kind of shallow. And I just thought, maybe I can make a contribution here to change the tone and to provide information. I'd already had a master's degree in apologetics, and I had just begun a master's degree in philosophy under J.P. Moreland over at Talbot, and their wonderful MA Phil program in philosophy of religion and ethics. And that was exactly what I needed, in my case, to supplement what I'd learned in apologetics. And that's a highly theological program. It's a long program. It's like 95 credits. It's huge for a master's degree, but probably a third or maybe even more of those credits were theology. And so this is Talbot School. I mean, it's a great environment. So I got a great set of skills added to my apologetics knowledge that I was able to, and right then was when we were starting Stand to Reason, to bring to the table in the conversation, so to speak. On the radio, because I was doing radio at the time, I was a staff pastor at a fairly large church in Southern California, but I was also doing weekend, radio for 3 to 6, so-called drive time, but it was the weekend. In any event, it gave me a lot of opportunity through the radio show and through what came to be known as Stand to Reason and its growing visibility, to take a lot of things that I was learning and then to pass them on. And Stand to Reason has always really been, I think, following my own impulse, a translation enterprise. So we can rub shoulders with all the smart guys, and I can figure out what they're saying and what they mean. And then I translate what they're saying into language people can understand. We call that throwing the ball so people can catch it. And this is what we have been about for the last 32 years. And I've written some things, mostly apologetics, but there's one book that's not principally apologetics. It's more a foundational book for understanding the Christian worldview. It's called The Story of Reality. And I think, it's kind of my attempt to provide what Lewis did 70 years ago in Mere Christianity, which amazingly to me, Jake, people think is hard to read.
Really?
He's like the most accessible author, but in any event, times have changed, and so have students or young people's capabilities. So I tried to take a little different tack, cover similar ground, but and do what he did, where he's explaining Christianity and offering kind of soft apologetics in the middle of that. I did the same thing with the story of reality. So these are all attempts. The story of reality, the tactics book, which we'll probably talk more about, another one called Street Smarts that relate to apologetics and evangelism. And I'm trying to provide tools for Christians not only to understand Christianity and be able to communicate it to others in kind of common sense language without a lot of theological jargon and, Christian mumbo jumbo, but just kind of straightforward, that story of reality, and then be able to navigate safely and effectively in conversations when there are a host of not just the older challenges that have always been around, but a bunch of new ones that are front and center and causing trouble for Christians making the case for Christianity. So that's what we've been doing. I've got a team now of almost 20 people. We have 4 full-time speakers. I know you've had Robbie Lashua on team. He was the last 2 years with us. Now he's off to a higher calling. He's pastoring a church. Good for him. We're all for that, obviously. And you got some people on the docket trying to get on board. From the rest of our team, John Noyes, maybe, I guess you've had John on before. Is that right?
2 weeks from now, he'll be on.
So, he will be
excited
on.
About that.
You're trying to corral Tim Barnett. Nevertheless, we're trying to get exposure, like through podcasts like this. We do a lot of speaking. I characteristically, I speak. I give 125 to 150 talks a year. I've been on 6 continents speaking. Nobody's asked me to come to the Antarctica yet, so but we'll see. Maybe there'll be a cruise, or something. But nevertheless, the point I'm making is, in 32 years, God has given us a very broad exposure in this country, but in lots of countries in the world, and not just me, but other teammates travel as well. And we just want to serve the body of Christ and help them to understand their own convictions more clearly and to think more carefully about them, and then to be able to pass those convictions on, to communicate those in a clear fashion so that others can consider it and the Holy Spirit will have something to work with. This is one little point I wasn't going to mention, but I think it is a good one here, and I do talk about it in Street Smarts. I noticed something when Jesus talked about the parable of the sower fairly recently that I hadn't noticed in the many times I've read it, that when he says and he explains to the disciples the seed that falls on the ground that the birds carry away, he tells them, well, that's the seed that falls on the hard ground, and the devil takes it away. Now, I thought, hard ground, those are hard-headed people. That makes sense. But here's what Jesus said. It's the seed that falls on the ground. The seed is spread, and the hearer doesn't understand it.
Oh, wow.
And then the devil carries it away. And then the fourth ground that was productive, they hear and understand and bear fruit, 30, 60, 100-fold. Now, it really made a big impression on me because I hadn't seen that, and I speak about it at more length in the Street Smarts book. But the short story is that, a lot of times we're just communicating in ways and with language people don't understand. So they can't even intelligently reject our account because they don't really understand what we're saying. So what we're trying to do at Stand to Reason, kind of in sum, is to bring this message with appropriate justifications, apologetics, to the body of Christ, to teach them how to take it to the rest of the world and speak in language they understand.
Yeah, that's so good. And, you mentioned the story of reality. This is the book. I highly recommend it for our listeners. This is the book that I recommend for new believers. I see it as a great discipling book, a great entry into the Christian worldview, because it's, like you mentioned, it's simple to understand. It's what C.S. Lewis, I guess, used to be. I guess not anymore.
Yes, that's right.
But it's also, it doesn't fail on the truth. And that's a hard line to follow, but you bring up some of the hardest issues for people, and you show that they fit in the Christian story. So to our listeners, I definitely recommend buying that.
And if I could add to that, that's what makes it so useful for non-Christians. I actually carry a copy with me all the time in my traveling bag because I end up getting in conversations and then I offer it to them, if they don't want it, that's fine. but it's a book you can give to any non-Christian, and you will not be embarrassed. I think you can attest to this. It's not. It doesn't sound. I don't talk like a Baptist
Yeah.
or a Presbyterian or a Pentecostal or whatever you want to, whatever
Yeah.
denomination you want to offend. I just talk like a human being.
Right.
And occasionally we use theological words that are appropriate, but they're fully explained and described. And, I have more accessible synonyms. So anyway, that's a book that folks might find really helpful to people who maybe are a little genuine seekers, open, but they're not sure what they're open to.
Right.
Give them this book, and I think that'll help.
Yeah, and the work, I mean, all of the work at Stand to Reason, I would highly recommend. I've benefited greatly, as I mentioned in the beginning of this program, in that when I first got saved, I got into apologetics because I was skeptical and I had questions, so I would find the answers.
Right.
And I read and still do read a lot of William Lane Craig and his philosophy and theology, and I thought, I have all the answers. This is great, and I am just going to yell at people till they hear me, and I'm going to say the right things. You can imagine how that went. It didn't go too well.
By the way, Bill, what's interesting is Bill doesn't even do that.
I know, yeah.
Craig, he's actually quite ironic, when he's engaging people. He's a great example of a good ambassador. But he gives you the supercharged stuff because he's so smart, and it's easy to come down heavy on somebody if you understand what he's saying.
Exactly.
Which you do, obviously,
Yeah,
so.
And I thought, as long as I'm saying the right things, I'm good. But then I read your book, and it was just a complete change of mind, and then the fruit started coming in my own personal family too. So it's quite amazing. I highly recommend our listeners str.org, Stand to Reason, check them out. Amazing resources. But Craig, at Truthful Hope, our goal primarily is to reach the hopeless with the one true living hope, and that's Christ in 1 Peter 3. And we try to do that through sound reasoning and also equipping Christians to do the same. However, in the outpost that I host, and for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a partnership with Stand to Reason, in that I run the group and I partner with Stand to Reason's content and their thinkers, and we lead a small group essentially in a church of answering tough questions. But in those, and when I speak to the youth groups and other speaking engagements, I constantly see students primarily hopeless in effectively sharing their faith with others. They don't know where to start. It's scary, right? How do I handle going up to someone proposing they follow Jesus, and then how do I handle an objection? It's too scary. I'm just not going to do it. And that's kind of their posture. So today, and I can't think of anyone better who has touched on this topic than you, and I would love for our listeners to walk away feeling equipped to better effectively communicate their Christian convictions to non-believers. And we could do that through your two books, Tactics and Street Smart. So before we dive any deeper, do you mind just providing an overview of these books? And I'm personally curious, what came to mind when you wrote these? Like, what influenced you to write Tactics?
Well, Tactics is the core. Street Smarts is actually, as you know, kind of a sequel where I take one aspect of what I call the tactical game plan, and then I expand on it, in spades. It's like tactics and the third step of tactics on steroids. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. But I have two kind of more general things to say about this whole enterprise. In my own style, I'm not usually going up to people and try to get in a conversation, like in a cold calling kind of way or a cold prospecting kind of way, as any salesman in the audience will understand, kind of way. I don't do that. There are some people who do that. I have friends. I mean, Kirk Cameron lives down the road. He's a good friend, and he's also kind of a disciple of Ray Comfort, and these guys, they rock and roll, but not everybody's equipped for that. And I was just thinking about this based on your question a moment ago, Jake, is that some Christians think that's the way they got to do it in order to be effective. Well, I'm just here to say that's not my style. I've done things like that before, especially during the Jesus movement many years ago, but that's not my style today. I'm trying to be available. I look for opportunities to begin to employ a game plan that I'll mention in a few moments. But that's the one thing I want just for them to think about. Don't try to press yourself into a Ray Comfort mold. If that's your style and that's what you do, he's great at it. I mean, there's nobody like Ray. If I go to his studios to film something for him, his staff calls and said, "Yeah, Greg's in the studio." He'll come over and he'll hand me a track. I got a new track. He gives me a track.
Mm.
In any event, so everybody's individual here, and the key thing is that we are in our hearts. We are available to God. Paul says in Colossians 4, conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders and make the most of the opportunity. Sometimes there's not really an opportunity, but when there is, maybe you can probe, and I'll explain about how I might do that. So that's the first thing. Second thing, as a general predicate here, is that I became a Christian in 1973. It was right in Southern California, no less. It was right in the heat, good word to describe it, of the Jesus movement. Right. It was just explosive. The first church that I even crossed the threshold of, 2 weeks after I became a believer, this is early November, was Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. I mean, go figure. It's like the movie. I lived that whole thing. And my head hair down to here, those were the days. And it was really exciting. And back then, of course, there was one evangelism style. You make an appeal to people with a simple gospel. You invite them to receive Christ, and a lot of them did. Well, that was 50 years ago, half a century ago. The world has changed. The message hasn't changed, but if we are going to speak in a way that people understand, so they can at least countenance the message, we have to, in a certain sense, adapt to the new things. And so over time, and you asked me, how did this kind of all come together for me? It actually came together, Jake, over a long period of time of engaging people in lots of ways. And one of the things that I realized, and again, this is a predicate to the game plan I'll get to in just a moment. So bear with me, because I think this is really important. And I do spend more time in Street Smarts talking about this concept. But I realized that, and here's an aphorism for you that kind of captures it. Before there can be a harvest, there's got to be a season of gardening. Before there can be any harvest, you got to have gardening first, okay? You got to have all the things that are necessary to bring a crop to fruition. Paul talked about that. I planted, Apollos watered, God caused the increase. But you see a little bit of the process there. And I actually think, and Jesus in John 4, after he talked to the woman at the well, talked to the disciples, he said, hey, you're about to reap where you didn't sow. There are sowers and there are reapers. There are different jobs and there are different seasons. Okay, this was a reaping season for Sychar. And someone got Jesus or whatever, talking to that woman, then she goes into town and tells everybody, gets everybody wound up. And then they talk to Jesus, then there's a harvest, and the disciples get the low-hanging fruit. But not everything is ready for a harvest. I don't know how you became a Christian, Jake, but it took me a long time, you know. And most people do not become Christians. I take polls every time I speak of this. At big churches, small churches, the numbers are the same. Most people do not become Christians by praying with someone to receive Jesus as Lord and Savior or coming forward at an altar call. There are no altar calls in the New Testament. There's none of this stuff like praying with Jesus. No, I'm not against that. I'm just simply saying, characteristically, the Holy Spirit works individually in a person after a season of gardening and thinking for that individual, and then the Holy Spirit brings the harvest in. And John Noyes, who you'll have on in 2 weeks from Stand to Reason, he was an atheist. Now he's an apologist. Ask him when his spiritual birthday is. He has no idea.
Same here. I have no clue. I'm very similar.
Yeah. Okay. So are 75% of all the people I polled. Right. So if your listeners are thinking the way I do effective evangelism is I got to challenge them to receive Christ. Well, I mean, for a lot of people, them's fighting words, right? Especially in our culture now. Well, they're going to sit on the bench. And what I'm saying is you don't need to do that. Now, this is controversial. I have people who push back on me on this, but usually those are harvesters. But I realized as over a period of reflection, Jake, that I was a gardener. And so here I've spoken on more than 90 university campuses. What am I doing? I'm gardening. I don't have altar calls. What do I do on the radio 35 years? I'm gardening. What am I doing like Story of Reality? I'm gardening. And most of what I do, and even in individual talks with people, I'm thinking about gardening. I'm not thinking about leading them to Christ. Now, when I tell people this and they start getting the picture that this is actually the New Testament model, that it creates a tremendous amount of freedom for them. Oh my goodness. I don't have to do that thing? No. It's isn't even the way the apostles did it.
Right.
Read the book of Acts. Wow, this opens it up for them. Now, with that in mind, with a changed perspective, and this took me years to for all the change to fall into the meter, right? Now you can go forward if you have a plan. And this is where the game plan comes in. And so now here's the basic principle of the game plan. You want to navigate in a friendly way in conversations with people. You want to navigate in a way that is interactive and you're not preaching at them. You want to navigate in a way that they'll pay attention and you'll get them thinking, and also in a way that is safe for you. Use questions. Use questions. The whole game plan that I use and my whole motif and tactics and the street smarts, it's all about using questions in different kind of creative ways. And I use as my own personal model for this, the infamous Lieutenant Colombo of TV fame. And most young people don't know who I'm talking about, but if you've been around for a while, it looks like you have been long enough to know he was the number one most recognizable TV character of all time. He was a detective, a murder detective, and he'd come in kind of at the crime scene, way under the wire. He actually looked stupid, the way he'd posture. He had the old trench coat and tousled hair and a cigar. He'd walk around. He never had a pencil or pen. He had to bum it off of somebody so he could take notes about stuff. But he's always asking these questions. And, okay, hey, one more thing, and more questions. And of course, that was the key to his effectiveness because he didn't scare people. They didn't take him seriously, for goodness sake, not early on, right? And all of a sudden, the bad guy is caught, cornered, because of the kinds of questions that were used. So this is like the mental picture I have in mind when I want to engage people. I'm going to use questions in a very particular way. And in the game plan that is outlined in the book Tactics, there's a number of different tactics in the book. They all have different names like Road Scholar and Taking the Roof Off and Just the Facts Ma'am and Steamroller. And these are all different kinds of maneuvers that will help you navigate. But they are all made to serve the game plan, which I call the Colombo Tactic, which has 3 parts. It's very simple. And the first 2 are so simple that anybody listening now with no training in apologetics or theology can employ to have productive conversations. And the first step is just to gather information. So if I'm sitting next to somebody on the plane, I'm just going to make conversation with them. If they're reading a book, I might ask them about the book. If they're wearing some kind of provocative-looking jewelry or something, I might ask them about that. I might ask them about their tattoo. Hey, you got skulls all over your arms. What's up with that? Not in a critical way, but you're making a statement about something. Okay, what is your statement? Now, of course, with skulls, for example, and there was one gal in the tactics book, I talk about this, who had a pentagram around her neck, and she was at a service provider at a kiosk, was getting some work done. And so I asked her about her jewelry, and turns out she was a witch. She was Wiccan. Actually, she identified herself as a pagan, which caught my wife. No, I'm a pagan. My poor wife got caught by surprise and started laughing.
Oh,
and she said, I'm sorry. I'd never heard anybody admit it before, though. So, that's all in the book.
Yeah.
But notice that all I'm doing is just gathering certain information, and I'm using a key question, a form of this key question. And all you got to remember is the key question, you can adapt it. And the question is, what do you mean by that? So I asked, what do you mean by the jewelry? What do you mean by the tattoo? Hey, what do you mean by the book? What do you mean? Whatever. Well, of course, I'm using different language appropriate to the issue. But then, but it's also really good, especially if you're under attack. Well, the Bible's been changed. What you have today isn't what you have. Or they'll just say the Bible's would change. And so I'm going to say, look, I know about textual criticism. I know the whole deal. That's my field. But I'm not going to lay this all on them. I'm going to ask them, what do you mean the Bible's been changed? Well, what you have now is not what was originally written. Really? How did that happen? That's another, what do you mean by that? I want them to spell this out. Now, I'm telling you a secret. When people raise objections and you ask them to explain it more clearly, you're going to get dead air, right? A lot of times, because they haven't really thought about it. They're responding with statements they've heard other people say that stonewalled Christians. So I might not know anything about textual criticism that is about that particular academic discipline that the person's referring to. It doesn't matter. I can still ask, what do you mean? And see, even if I know nothing, what I'm going to do is get an education about that complaint. All right. And let them talk. And every time they try to explain something, give me more detail about what they mean, I suspect even in that, there are going to be ambiguities in what they say. Well, they might say the manuscripts, these people copied manuscripts and they made changes. Really? Did they make the changes on purpose? Or did you make them by accident? Oh, I don't know. All I want them to do is to keep talking. Now, some people might wonder, why would you want them to keep talking about their view, which you disagree with? Well, if I disagree with it because I think it's false. And if their view is false and I allow them to keep talking about it, chances are the bigger the hole they are digging for themselves, because I'm paying attention to what they're saying. Now, obviously, as you get more experience in this, it's easier to see things and you'll know how to go further. But the first thing is just gather information. You need intel. You don't need to be clever. Just show an interest in their views. And if you don't do anything else after that, that's it. Well, you've just gotten a bit of an education. You get the lay of the land a little bit. You also find out these people aren't as scary as you thought. You're having a nice conversation. All right. But I'll give you one other example of this because I play this trick on audiences when I get to this point in the talk. I say, by the way, does this church take the Bible do you guys take the Bible literally? Everybody, oh, yeah, their hands go up. I said, so you think Jesus is a stick, right? I am the vine, you are the branch. Oh, we're all sticks. And then they're looking at me, dumbfounded. Well, I didn't mean it that way. And I said, no, of course you didn't mean it that way. But you fell into a hole. Why? Because you didn't ask the right question. So if I asked you, do you take the Bible literally? You should have said what? Audience response, what do you mean by that? Or some variation. Same thing with evolution. You believe in evolution? No, not us. What, you don't think things change over time? My own theology has evolved. Oh, well, we didn't mean it that way. Well, why didn't you say, what do you mean by evolution? So this is, I just give these illustrations to show that this question is very flexible, and it's the kind of question that will protect you when you're under attack. Because again, when you ask that question, which is a fair question to get clarity, the other person may not be able to respond with clarity. And you know what that does? It takes the wind out of their sails. It just almost, like many cases, almost immediately, it's like you poked him with a pin. Now, we're not doing it to have a mic drop moment or anything like that. We're doing something legitimate, gathering information, finding what they got, and what is the true nature of the objection. All right, so that's the first step. You gather information with some form of the question, what do you mean by that? The second question I call reversing the burden of proof. Okay, now, some people might not be familiar with that phrase, but burden of proof is the responsibility, burden, that someone in the conversation has to prove something. All right? Now, I'll tell you the way it usually goes. The atheist says, there is no God. The Christian says, okay, if they have done some study and listen to Bill Craig or somebody like that, or stand to reason. Well, here are 4 reasons why God exists. Wait a minute. What did you just do? You are now taking the responsibility to disprove his view. That's now how it's supposed to work. Because the rule is the person who makes the claim bears the burden of proof. So if we say there is a God, it's up to us to give some reasons why. If they say there is no God, it's not up to us to give reasons against that view. It's first his job or hers to give reasons why they think there is no God. All right. So that's reversing the burden of proof. We're not going to let the critic essentially say, prove me wrong. It's not our job. It's their job to give reasons. So this is where so you understand now what that second step is. Now that has a question too, a model question. And the second question is something like, okay, how did you come to that conclusion? Or what are your reasons for that? Or in the case of the atheist, why do you think there is no God? Now, they might say the problem of evil or blah, 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 whatever, and maybe we'll get to that in a little bit. But notice now you're getting more substance. You're letting them talk more. And once again, you may get dead air because they haven't thought about the reasons that they don't think there's a God in that particular case. I had a guy say to me once, I can't remember what the issue was, but he said, well, I don't have any reasons for the view I just expressed.
Wow.
And now, well, at least it was candid, right?
Yeah.
And I said, well, I have another question for you. Notice the question, because this occurred to me immediately. And the question was, why would you believe something that you have absolutely no reason to believe? And he said, I don't have any reasons for that.
At least he's consistent.
Yeah, he's very consistent. But you know what it does. No, was that progress? I don't know. But at least now he knows he's got nothing. Right? Now, I failed to mention something else that's really important to this whole thing. And you know this concept, Jake, and that is what I am trying to do is not to persuade someone in that moment of my view. I'm not trying to lead them to Christ. I already hinted at that. All I want to do is get them thinking. That's it. Now, I have a phrase that I use to describe that. You know what it is. What is it?
Put a rock in their shoe.
Put a rock in their shoe.
Yeah.
I just want to put a rock in their shoe. Everybody's had a rock in their shoe. It's not the end of the world, but you got to deal with it.
Every time I have a rock in my shoe now, I think about that phrase.
There you go.
The meaning of it.
Yeah. And so all my goal is in any conversation is to just say something that gets them thinking. Oh, I never thought of that before. I got to chew on it. No, I might be able to put more than one rock in a shoe, but at least that's my goal. Maybe I can't do it at all. But notice I've lowered the demand on me, and I'm suggesting for your listeners, viewers, that lower the demand on them too. That's what you're shooting for when you're using the game plan. The first step, gathering information. The second step, finding if they have any reasons for the view they have. So I guess a simple way of putting it is you want to find out what their view is and what their own reasons for their view is. That's it. That's the first two steps. You're 2/3 along right now in the whole game plan. Now, the third step is more complicated. It's a little more advanced, but here's what I want to confirm or encourage your audience with, and that is if you just are a student of other people's views and you ask them, what do you mean by that? And ask them, why do they believe what they just said they think is true? God is going to use that. I've seen it time and time and time again. And many people, come up to me afterwards after I give a presentation. Oh, yeah, I read the book and here's what happened to me. And I didn't even try kind of thing. And this is what took place because they started employing this. So I want your listeners to keep in mind that the key to navigating effectively is using questions. Now, I've just given you a couple of steps with some model questions. But if you get stuck and you're not sure what to do, just take a tip from Lieutenant Colombo and always ask questions. So that's the basics. Now, the third one, I'll just give you the step. Maybe we can talk about some details in a moment. This one's a little bit more complicated because the first two steps, you don't need to know anything. The third step is simply to use questions to make a point. Now, your point might be something about your own view, but there's a way you can use questions to get your own view out. You might be using questions to show a weakness or a flaw in the other person's view. And then that gets them thinking. It's a stone in their shoe. But Jesus said to be harmless as doves and shrewd as serpents, something like that. So this is where this issue comes in here. We're going to be gentle and amicable, friendly, easygoing, not like bellicose and fighting and all that. At the same time, we are going to ask some questions that might make them uncomfortable because they don't know how to answer it. Or, and this is the real sweet spot, the common sense answer to the question we ask is going to play into our point of view. And when they answer the question, it's almost like we're enlisting them as an ally to prove our point. Instead of us declaring it, we are letting them respond to the question. And then when they do, okay, that's good. That one's for me. That helps me towards my end. Now, you don't have to say that. It's implicit in the conversation. And when in some of these conversations, when you get to the kind of aha moment, the conclusion where it comes all together, they have no place else to go. Now, it doesn't mean that they're, now I'm convinced I'm going to become a Christian. They're probably not going to do anything like that. Not right then. But these things have a way of eating away at people. And I'm just going to appeal to the autobiographies of your listeners as they look up at their own lives, and people said things that, they just resisted and shined on at the moment, but later began to eat away. Who does the eating? The Holy Spirit's doing that. But what we're doing is we're giving fodder for that process in the game plan. So first, gather information with some form of the question, what do you mean by that? Second, reverse the burden of proof with the question, how'd you come to that conclusion, or some variation? And the third, you want to make a point, but there's no key question, really. I suggest some things in the tactics book you can say, have you ever considered, or whatever. But really, the question is going to be germane to the problem you see with the point of view that the person has just expressed. And in the Street Smarts book, I go through that third step, to lay the foundation for it in tactics. But the whole Street Smarts book is all about that third step. And then all kinds of different issues like atheism, or questions about Jesus, or about the Bible, or about abortion, or about sex and gender and homosexuality, all of that stuff. These are front and center. So what I show is what's wrong with the issues. Now, here's model conversations with the initial questions. So you see how this works, and maybe you'll incorporate some of that stuff into your game plan, your own style of engaging with Christians.
So good. It was like a revelation to me when I read it. And I'll tell you a funny story. When I was on my honeymoon, in some all-inclusive resort, I was just a Christian, and I was just saved and into apologetics, as I mentioned, following William Lane Craig religiously. And I started reading your tactics book for the first time. And I'm on the beach, and I'm laying down, and the pool waiter comes over, and he's like, "What book are you reading?" And my heart starts pounding. It's racing. I'm like, "Oh, here we go. I got to make a case for Christianity." And I look down at the title, and a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. And I'm like, well, if I'm going to be reading this book at any time, it's probably now.
Yeah.
And I said, Christian book, defending the faith. And he was like, "Oh, me and Jesus aren't on the same page as of late." And I was ready to come at him with, "Oh, but the resurrection, and oh, but all this."
Wait, let me interrupt for just a second.
Yeah.
Jake, repeat for me. I didn't hear it clearly what it was that he said to you. He said, me and Jesus are not on the same page?
Not on the same page.
Okay.
Yeah, with a kind of distressing demeanor. Yeah. And instead of giving a statement, I thought about your phrase, use questions whenever possible instead of statements. And I did that, and I said, well, why is that? A simple Colombo 1.
Absolutely.
And it broke out into a fruitful conversation, really good. And my wife and I got premium treatment the whole time.
So my goodness.
It was a win-win.
So you had the cleanest pool.
Yeah.
But that's exactly right. I mean, apart from what you had been reading in the book, your impulse would have been, now I have to defend the faith.
Right.
I have to tell him why Jesus is good and not bad, like he probably thinks he is. I mean, that's the presumption you make from the comment.
Right.
But we don't know in what sense he thinks Jesus is bad or he's not on good terms with Jesus. There may be a whole story there about him growing up as a Christian, and then his dad went out and his mom, and then they all left, and then they left the church. What good is this Christianity, man? I don't like Jesus because my dad.
Yeah.
Well, you never know what the story is until you let him talk.
Right.
And then you get, that's gathering information. So it's a great example, Jake.
Yeah. And it really goes to show how important tactics is. And like you said, you only covered the Colombo Tactic. There's so many others in this book. Maybe I could show it to our listeners. It might be a little reverse, but Tactics, go get it on Amazon, wherever you get your books. It is a life changer. I cannot recommend it more. That was the first part of my interview with Greg Koukl of Stand to Reason about tactics for effectively sharing the faith with non-believers. Look out for the concluding half of this conversation in a separate episode next week. Thanks for listening, and God bless.